Okay, class. Hi everyone. We're going to talk for a few minutes about behaviorism and incentive theory. So let me see if I can get this to do the slideshow. Great. So this week, or this module, you are working on um, readings related to behaviorism, which is a theory that sort of complements and builds on cognitive learning theories, in that behaviorism really focuses on how external stimuli affect the individual and how that can lead to learning and behavior change. There's that great video called Learning that is on the learner.org site that gives a good overview of the experiments that were designed to come up with these theories. So the purpose of this video and slideshow is really just to sort of review what you learned in that video and to reinforce a few key concepts. So one thing that we have not discussed is the idea of how behaviorism is tied to reinforcement and incentives. So I'm going to talk about another theory of motivation called the incentive theory. And incentive theory is born out of behaviorism, but basically it's the idea that we are driven by this desire or pull towards a reward, so an incentive. So these can be external rewards, and that can elicit certain behaviors. I see this a lot with my son. If he was a great vegetable eater when he was little, he's still little, but now that he's getting a little older, he doesn't want to eat vegetables as much. So, you can do incentive theory with him. You can say, okay, if you want to have a cracker, or if you want to have something else, then you need to eat X first. And that works really well with him. So I guess it's a form of bribery, I'm not sure. But it's also seen as an incentive that can elicit the behaviors that you're desiring. Okay, so one question for you when you think about being a teacher is, what ways do you plan to use rewards such as gold stars, smiles, treats, special privileges, grades in your teaching? And how would you do that, and why would you do that? So take a minute and just think about how you would use rewards, if you would, and why you would use rewards. Okay, so if we were in a classroom setting, I imagine many of you would plan to use rewards, and that you've seen them used frequently in classrooms. So just to briefly go back to that slide, rewards can take the form of, anything from food to points to certificates and gold stars to time incentives. There's so many different types of rewards, but this is a form of a behavioral reinforcement. Some people are against using these kinds of incentives in a classroom, so I think it's really a personal decision in terms of what you think motivates your students and whether or not that is an effective motivator, because in some cases it may not be effective and in fact may work the opposite for you. It may actually disincentivize some of your students. So we talked about social cognitive views of learning last week. So remember that with, thinking about Piaget, Vygotsky, Erikson, these other theorists, that social cognitive views learning as an internal process that may or may not lead to behavior change. Behaviorists view learning as a relationship between stimulus and response, and learning leads to change in behavior. So incentive theory has its roots in this view. So when we think about behaviorism, the basic assumptions are people's behavior is a result of what they encounter in their environment. So if you have ever had or seen a pet that has been abused, chances are that that behavior that pet is displaying, maybe cowardice or even aggression, can be because of the fact that pet had been abused. So we get these behaviors through interactions with our stimuli in the environment, through people, through encounters, through things that shape a behavior. So that's what's called conditioning, this idea that we are conditioning a behavior to become stronger or weaker. So learning is the relationship among stimuli and responses. That's where learning evolves. It usually involves a behavior change, and this does not always include mental events. So a good example of this is if you have panic attacks and they come up from, without warning, and you become very panicked and very scared. Well, if you have that, then that might affect your behavior. You might decide to not go to public places as often or leave the house as often. So one stimulus can affect other behaviors, and that's this idea of behaviorism. So, and it can be shaped. It can be a gradual, change in that behavior, either towards something positive or towards something negative. So Pavlov, as you guys probably are familiar with, has his experiment with the dog. So I'm going to show you that. Well, sorry, I guess I didn't have that slide. But anyway, his experiment is when he offers the bell to the dog. He rings a bell while he's feeding the dog. The food automatically stimulates a salivation response. And then as he's ringing the bell, he's complementing the food with another stimulus. He's pairing that two stimuli together, and to the point where he can just ring the bell without using food and still get the dog to salivate. So if you saw the learning video, the examples using the children and the animals is an example of that. So they paired presentation of an animal with a really loud, uncomfortable noise. It made the child upset, and eventually they could take the noise away, but the animal itself would elicit the same upset response. So it's the idea that you can create an unconditioned stimulus and create that same response. So in a classroom, we see that a lot of ways. If a teacher blinks the lights on and off, generally the kids get quiet, right? That's an unconditioned stimulus that gets this response. There's a lot of different kinds of behaviorist classical conditioning principles that follow behavior management routines. Now, the other person that's really well known in this field is B.F. Skinner, and he, as you learned from the video, came up with this idea of operant conditioning. So basically he says we learn something because of consequences. They're either desirable, so we want to do it again, or we stop doing it because the consequences are such that we don't want to do the behavior again. So that could be related to punishment or negative reinforcement. So this slide is really helpful for understanding the difference between positive and negative reinforcement. And I think this is one I really want you to take away from, because people get really confused about negative reinforcement. Both positive and negative reinforcement have something to do with a stimulus, okay? So you're increasing or decreasing the probability of behavior by using either a positive stimulus or a negative stimulus. So you're adding a stimulus, and by adding or removing, you are increasing or decreasing a behavior. So in positive reinforcement, if we add a stimulus, so we say, I'll give you $5 if you make an A, then the stimulus is money, and it's something we want, so it reinforces this behavior, which is to study harder. Negative stimulus is something we don't want to have to experience, so we try to increase our behavior in order to remove that stimulus. So if you know you have to take a final exam, and that's a negative stimulus because taking an exam can be stressful, then it might encourage you to have perfect attendance, because if, say, the teacher says if you come every day to class, you don't have to take the exam. So the behavior you're increasing here is good attendance, And the stimulus that you're trying to remove is the stress associated with the final exam. So just be aware that with negative reinforcement, you're still increasing a desired behavior. You're not decreasing the behavior. But the difference is you have a negative stimulus that the person is trying to avoid. So, for instance, if you know that if you have a lot of work to do and a lot of studying to do, but you also want to go play outside, then you might go ahead and get your studying done very quickly so you could spend more time outside. So the negative stimulus is the studying, and you want to remove that. You want to get rid of that. So you want to study harder, and that's a good behavior, but you're also taking away that stress and that anxiety so you can go play. So I hope this makes sense. Now, the two types of conditioning that decrease behavior, so both positive and negative reinforcement increase behavior. Two types of conditioning that decrease behavior in operant conditioning are response cost and punishment. So response cost is a positive stimulus. So by removing it, you would decrease the behavior. So if you said, I need you to stop arguing with your brother. If you don't stop arguing with your brother, neither of you are going to go get ice cream later. So that's going to cause them to stop arguing because they know that they're going to lose something they want, a positive stimulus. That's response cost. So if you don't decrease your behavior, it's going to cost you something. On the other hand, punishment is when you add that negative stimulus. So it says, if you guys keep arguing, I'm going to send you to detention, or you're going to get timeout. That's a punishment because you're adding a stimulus. You're not taking something away they wanted. So again, it's really a matter of, does it increase behavior or decrease behavior? And then is it a positive stimulus or a negative stimulus? And that's kind of how you know the difference between these types of conditioning. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to kind of go through my other slides because I want to talk about incentives. Well, I will go back and talk about this for a second. So just for a second. Okay, so when we think about incentives in education, so we think about what kind of like ideas or objects would make children want to learn more. We've talked, I can imagine that when you think of incentives, you think of candy, or you think of privileges, or something that a student would want to experience, right? So incentives play a role in education. So do they work? Do they elicit real learning? Do they elicit good behavior change? Do they elicit long-term behavior change? Or are they temporary? So, and do certain types of incentives work better than others? So I wanted to share this one quick study with you called the Hamilton Project. And Allen and Fryer wanted to look and see if incentives had any impact on student performance. So they wanted to see if it would help kids who did not have motivation, or if incentives were contingent on other resources or knowledge that were needed to achieve, like just being a good teacher. That's important to learning in general. And they wanted to know if incentives would actually undermine intrinsic motivation, because there's some arguments that giving kids too many external incentives takes away their natural intrinsic desire to learn. And that's definitely a cautionary tale and something to be concerned about, because we don't want to take away kids' natural desire to learn by incentivizing them. I've heard of stories where kids love doing something and they'll do it because they love it, and then you start offering them money to do it, and then they don't want to do it anymore. So we have to be careful about incentivizing and knowing when is the right time to do it. So they looked at 5 cities, and they had different kinds of incentives. One was, and so the idea was they were going to encourage kids to read more. So one was to give them money for each book that they read. One was to give them money for meeting certain behavioral expectations. One was to give students and parents money for receiving, or students and parents got money for receiving passing math objectives on a short test. One was students were paid to take tests, and then one was students earned money to get a good grade. So which incentives do you think worked and made a difference in basically like educational outcomes? So the best one was the money given for reading the books. So if you go back and look at all of this, the one out of all of these incentives that got the most educational attainment, so the best scores, was giving the money for book. That's very interesting. Money for behavior also yielded gains. So telling them to, attend, giving them money to attend daily, wearing uniform, all that. That also made a difference. Mastery of math objectives did not yield. And paying for grades and standardized tests did not yield. So, why do you think that happened? So we don't have small table groups here, but going back, I'll just kind of tell you that if you think about it, the money is related to input, telling kids to do certain things that are going to help them actually learn. So reading more is known to help students have better reading comprehension. Money for behavior, attendance, going to school, I could see how that could also yield gains. But if a kid doesn't do the inputs, it doesn't matter how much money you give them, they're not going to do better on the test. So money, mastery of math objectives, paying for taking tests, just doing those things does not necessarily yield better results. What really helps them are incentivizing the strategies and the tasks that are needed to actually learn more. So giving them money for the inputs, not on the outputs. Okay, I'm going to skip the teacher incentive, and I'll send you this video from Dan Pink about motivation. But basically, this idea is that some say incentives could diminish intrinsic motivation. So if you start paying me for something I love to do, it becomes a job. However, some found that incentives did not diminish intrinsic motivation. So it could actually, if you have a few incentives, like getting an incentive to read a book, you might actually activate a desire to continue reading books. So limitations, attempts at changing only behaviors may ignore cognitive factors interfering with learning, and then reinforcement for academic tasks may encourage students to do things really quickly rather than well. And that's something to be concerned about if you offer incentives. Again, thinking about how you use them is very important, because if you say, I'll give you a piece of candy as soon as you finish your worksheet, that doesn't necessarily encourage them to do their worksheet well. It just encourages them to do them quickly. So think about how you're using the incentives and what behavior you're trying to elicit from them, because it could be working against you if you don't really think through that behavior you're encouraging. Extrinsic reinforcement of an activity that students already love and find reinforcing can undermine student interest. So, think about that. If you know a student is already highly motivated in a certain area, this is an area where you don't really need to tamper with that. You don't need to offer an incentive, because it may actually sort of take some of the joy out of it and make it a job. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I hope this quick review is a good supplement to the video.